everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Kelly and we are here to talk about books. Today I thought we would go through all of the books that I read this year in 2020. This is the most books that I've read in a year in a long time. And this is some very attainable booktuber goals because while you have people reading hundreds of books in a year, I myself read 32 and I'm not mad about it. We're just gonna start with the first book that I read this year and work our way down to the end. Most of these books I consumed as audiobooks, or I borrowed them from friends, or I already packed them away, so I'm not going to dig them out. But those that I have access to, I have pulled, so we'll have some of them to show. I started out this year coming out of a reading slump, so I wanted to start off with a series of short books that I could get through pretty quick, get myself on a roll, and I had been wanting to do a Narnia reread for a while because I hadn't read them since I was a kid, and I remembered really loving them. For anyone who somehow does not know, Narnia is a series of classic children's fantasy by C.S. Lewis. They tell the stories from the beginning to the end of this fantasy land of Narnia that is sort of parallel to our own, and children often pop in and out of Narnia from our world. I read The Magician's Nephew, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Horse and His Boy. I started Caspian, and by that point I just had to admit to myself that I was not enjoying myself, and that is how I discovered that I don't like Narnia, and I swear there will someday be a video where I don't mention that, but it's not today. Today we have to talk about how I don't like Narnia, because I don't. I liked The Magician's Nephew. I thought it was cute. It was written after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if I remember correctly. But it takes place before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but there's little references to things that happen in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, so there was a little, like, nostalgia factor. There were little, like, callbacks, call forwards. I don't know. I enjoyed that. It's a cute story. It's fine. And then The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was all nostalgia factor. I liked it for that, and that really alone. It was very charming, but I was bored. And then The Horse and His Boy was a lot of yikes, racist. And I know that the other kingdom of brown people that features in this story was like his brother's made up fantasy kingdom and he wrote it into his book and whatever. I don't care. It still came off as incredibly racist. And I was excited at first because I didn't realize that the protagonist was a little white boy. I thought that he was one of this other race of people, but he wasn't. The one nice person that we get from this place actually turns out to be a white person anyway. So that was fun. I hated it. And I tried to read Prince Caspian, but I just put it down about halfway through and I never picked it back up again because I just didn't care and I was so bored. And I like the movies a lot better, and the movies are fine. So, sorry. Don't come for me. Alright, I don't care. You can like Narnia if you want to. Next, I finished off the Raven Boys series with The Dream Thieves, Blue Lily Lily Blue, and The Raven King. I had read The Raven Boys back in 2019. They follow the story of a group of codependent rich boys who go to an uppity private school, and they make friends with this girl who is part of a family of people who all have psychic powers, and she is the only one who doesn't have psychic powers. The magic and world building in it is so much fun, and the plot is like a very intriguing little like adventure, but it's the characters. I don't know what to even say about these books except that I think about them like every other day, at least. I think about them all of the time. Ronan is everything to me. I love him with all of my heart, and I would die for any of them. I would die for any of the Raven Boys or for Blue. I know that they're fictional. I know that they're fictional, but I would die for them. Read them. The next book that I read was Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. I wanted to read this book because the movie Practical Magic is one of my favorite movies of all time. I love it. It's so good and spooky and fun, and I was hoping that we would get some of that from the book, which did not happen. The book is about a family of witches who have a curse upon them that any man who falls in love with them will die. And we follow two daughters of this family. I don't even really remember much about the plot of the book. It's very different from the movie, which is fine, and that's not why I didn't like it. It was just, there was a lot of promise built up in the beginning of like, oh, it's gonna be so magical, and we're building up, like, we spent time in the aunt's house, and they are so cool, and their house is so magical and so fun to be in, and then we just leave and never go back, and it weirdly sexualized one of the young teenage girls in a way that just didn't, it wasn't like offensive to me, but it just didn't sit right. It was weird. Next, I read Beowulf, and this is the verse translation by Frederick Rebsamen? Rebsamen. I don't know. I'm sorry, this person. And I loved it. I was very surprised at how much I loved it. I had read excerpts of Beowulf for school, but I had never read the whole thing, and I don't speak Old English, so I can't speak to how like good of a translation it is, but the experience of reading this version of the story was so cool. I read it mostly out loud to myself, and it was just so like rhythmic and fun that and it was just the right length where by the time I was starting to get like, okay, I get it, we're doing this like monsters, Old English kings, whatever, I'm over it. By the time I started to feel that way, it was over, and it was perfect. As a lover of fantasy, reading something like this that is so influential to so much modern fantasy, it's kind of this like quintessential, like old English fantasy monster story. Like, that's so cool, and to see the root of a lot of modern stories was very interesting. And I know there are a lot of Beowulf translations that people really don't like. I've been told that Tolkien's is horrible. So if you are interested in the story of Beowulf and you haven't read it before and you want a version that is more digestible, I recommend this one. Haven't read any of the other ones, but I liked this one. Next up, I read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I read this with a book club that my gym put together at the beginning of quarantine, and we were trying to figure out what book to read, and I was like, hey, let's do the one about a group of people trapped on an island together and they can't leave and they all slowly die one by one. That sounds great for quarantine, right? So that's what the book's about, and it was really good. A+. It's no secret, it's not spoilers, that everyone dies. Like, that's what the book is. That's the premise of the book. There's this nursery rhyme that they keep encountering when they're invited to this island, and the nursery rhyme details these 10 little soldier boys, and each one of them gets picked off in a different way. And the deaths of the characters kind of mirror the nursery rhyme, and so I kept trying to think to myself like how each one was going to die based on the nursery rhyme, but I never really got it right. It was very clever, very well done. The groundwork of like the whodunit was very beautifully laid, and it's brilliant. It's quintessential Agatha Christie. There you go. Oh, next I read Radium Girls. I read this also for the book club, and this one I listened to as an audiobook while I was shelving books at work, and it's a nonfiction about the dial painters in the 1920s. They were these young women who used radium paint to paint the faces on clocks and watches and stuff and dials for the military so that they would glow in the dark. And radium is, radioactive and causes all sorts of problems if you are exposed to it. And these women were not only not given any way to protect themselves, they were not only not told that it could harm them, they were actually told that it was good for them, and they were encouraged to point their paintbrushes by putting them in their mouths. And so they were ingesting small amounts of radium every day, and eventually many of them ended up getting very gruesomely ill. Their bones were rotting in their bodies. Their bones were coming out of their bodies while they were still alive. It's very hard to read. It was horrific. I can't believe that, like, there's been a few books that have come out about this. I've seen some people talk about it online in the last couple of years, but, like, how did we never hear about this before? And, like, we never have talked, like, who decided that when we are in school that we shouldn't be learning about things like this about America? Like, these corporations knew that it was harmful, and the men who were working in the factories producing the radium paint were given all sorts of protection, and they were well aware that it could kill you, and yet these young women were just so disposable that they got to have their lives just rotted away. And it was, it infuriated me. It made me cry. It made me feel sick a few times. Not for the faint of heart, but it was very, very good. It got a little bit long-winded sometimes, and there were a lot of names. She really talked about a lot of these individual women's stories, which I really liked, but I definitely lost track of who people were a lot. But still, I definitely would recommend either this, or there are a couple other books, like I said, that are about the same topic, but it was hard to get through. Next, I read Coraline by Neil Gaiman, which is like a middle grade horror about a young girl who moves to a new house and discovers a little door that leads to a parallel universe where there are other parents of hers and other neighbors, and they all have buttons for eyes, and her other parents want to convince her to stay there. I really liked this story. It was like exactly the perfect version of what it was, if that makes sense. And I listened to the audiobook for this as well, which Neil Gaiman narrates himself, and there are some really cool little like songs in it and music and effects, like little sound effect things, and it was very creepy, very fun, and it was just a nice little short, like, it was a good romp. Next, I read The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Yeah, that's how you say it. This is a classic. It's about a young girl who is orphaned, so she moves in with some relatives. One of them is a very sickly young boy, and there is a section of the garden that is walled off and no one is allowed to go inside because that was the mother of the sickly boy. It was her garden, and she died, and ever since then, the father has closed it off and not allowed anyone to go in. But of course the young girl becomes just enamored with the idea of this garden, and she has to see what's in it. And this book was very charming, and when I first read it, I felt like almost only positive vibes. But the more I look back on it, the more I'm like, the ending was weird. This book definitely suffers a little bit as a product of its time. There were certain things that I was like, ooh, okay, that's fine, whatever. But it wasn't prevalent enough to put me off, and overall I really enjoyed the story. I thought the children were very charming, and I liked seeing how they helped each other grow and change. The next books that I'm going to talk about, I did not read one after the other. I read them very slowly over the course of the entire year, but the first one is in the list there, so we're going to talk about it now. The Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, Tolkien, obviously. If you don't know what these are about, I can't help you, like, if you want to know my thoughts, that was my first video, was ranting about these, and I haven't gotten to the third one yet. My one reading goal for this year, really, was that I wanted to read all of Lord of the Rings. That being said, this year did not turn out as anyone thought it would, and I did not account for worldwide trauma when I was making my reading goals. So when it came time for me to pick up the third book, I am very much a mood reader, and it's not that I wasn't in the mood for Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings, to sit down and read a chapter or even a scene or two, for me, requires a bit of time. I like to sit in it. I like to marinate in it, and I just, by the end of this year, I wasn't having that. I was working on my novel, I was distracted, and I needed to be reading things that were a little bit, that just didn't require as much of a time commitment or a brain power commitment necessarily. So we're putting off book 3 until next year. I cannot wait to get to it. Every time I do pick it up, I've started it a little bit, and every time I pick it up, I have the time of my life, but just getting myself to pick it up has been a little bit hard, so I'm not putting that pressure on myself. I want to wait to read it until I can fully bask in the glory of it, and when the time comes, I will do another probably gushing rant video, because, I mean, can you blame me? Following that, I read Dracula. First of all, can we appreciate the cover of this book? This is beautiful. Dracula is, if you don't know, a vampire story. And it follows a man who goes to stay with Dracula and realizes there's some shady stuff going on, manages to escape, but is damaged by this kind of forever, and it follows him and his wife and some friends of his. I picked this book up because I wanted some sweet, like, older, more classic vampire lore. I don't know who gave Bram Stoker the permission to make me care more about the characters than I did about the vampire stuff, but that's what happened, and I can't believe it. I'm sure people know that. I didn't know that the characters in this were good. Like, they were incredible. I mean, it was a little heavy-handed with the, like, oh, these men are just, perfect. Men are just so good. Like, there was a little much of that for me. But other than that, oh my goodness, they were so good. And to be fair, the men in this book were incredible. Van Helsing is a beautiful man, and I love him. He was so cool and fun, and I want him to be my uncle. And the friendship between Mina and Lucy, oh man, it broke me a little bit. I listened also to this one as an audiobook while I was at work, sobbing in the shelves. It's fine. It was fine. Oh man. I also didn't know that it was written as like a series of letters and documents and stuff. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about this book, apparently. Ooh. My next book was Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. I couldn't tell you what this book is about. I think a girl, she goes to be a governess. I was bored. Maybe I didn't get it or something, but wow, I was bored. I remember basically nothing about it. There was just nothing. Agnes was nothing. The plot was nothing. I think there was a romance. Was that the point? There's a romance. Nothing. I got nothing. I'm sorry. That one just didn't do it for me. After that, I started a reread of Harry Potter. I got through the first one, and I'm currently on the second one. I will probably be done with it by the end of the year, so I'm including that here. I read Harry Potter 1 and 2. Harry Potter, if you don't know, is about a boy wizard who goes to magic school. It's good. That's all you're getting out of me. The Little White Horse is next on the list by Elizabeth Goudge. This book was lent to me by a very dear friend of mine who, Megan, if you are watching, just skip this part. I liked it because I could see some of this friend of mine in the book, and I could see some of how the writing of this book influenced her art. So the book is about another orphaned girl who goes to live with some family members, and this house that she is going to live in and that she will be inheriting, it's like in a little fairyland. It's beautiful. It's in this silvery forest, and there's this very charming little town. It's very pastoral. It is very much a little girl's like dream kind of story. And as that, it does a really good job. The characters were very quaint. The world building was gorgeous. The language was really like fun and flowery and very purple, and I like that. And everything was just a little, like, it was so whimsical, and that part of it was great. But there were just a few things that really didn't sit right with me. The most obvious probably being that at the end, spoiler alert, the main character gets married when she's 14. At least it's to a boy her age, but still, what? There's a lot of overt woman bashing throughout the entire book. Like, the men just, like, vitriolically detest women. They're never criticized for it. The narrative never punishes them for it. The narrative never even attempts to prove them wrong. And our young heroine is over and over again chastised both by the adults around her and by the narrative for being curious, for asking questions, for having a backbone of any kind. Okay, moving on. Megan, you can come back. Ooh, this is exciting. Up next is the first manga that I ever read, Death Note. I read the first 4 volumes of this year. I don't know if I'm going to be finishing it. I read them because I watched the show earlier this year for the first time, and wow, I've already rewatched it. I was working at a bookstore earlier this year, and I was just reading them at the bookstore on my breaks, and I no longer work there, so I don't know if I'm gonna keep reading them. I got the first one just to like have it. Death Note is about a boy named Light Yagami who is the star pupil, and he finds a notebook that says inside that any human whose name is written in the notebook will die, and he decides to use this weapon that he's found to kill off criminals and create a utopia. Light is a fascinating study of an absolutely psychopathic narcissist with a raging god complex, and the detective L, who ends up taking on the case of trying to figure out who's killing all of these people. He is so brilliant and sweet maybe is the wrong word for him, but I look at him and I'm like, that's my son, and I love him. They are both such geniuses, and watching the chess match between them, oh, it's so good. I haven't finished the manga, but it is, as far as I read, essentially exactly the same as the anime. I don't know if I assume that continues through to the end of the story, but I will say based on the show, it is one of the most perfectly executed stories I've ever seen. The next book I read was Skinfolk by Nalo Hopkinson, which is a collection of short stories that are creepy and dark and poignant, hard to read. They made me cry, they made me laugh, they made me feel slightly sick sometimes, but they incorporate a lot of Caribbean folklore, and they talk a lot about identity, like racial identity, and they're so... I've never experienced anything quite like them. It's a short story collection, so it's hard to say. Like, there were some that I really loved, and there were some that I liked, and there were like 1 or 2 that I was like, what? No. But that's just the nature of short story collections. But oh wow. Oh wow. After how much I loved the Raven Boys, I wanted to read a little bit more Maggie Stiefvater, so I tried Shiver. Shiver is a young adult fantasy that's about a girl who is obsessed with the wolves who live in her woods, and it's a story about one of the wolves who is actually a werewolf. I mean, they like change for the season rather than for the night, and it was fun. I liked it fine. I was very disappointed because I had such high hopes, because Stiefvater's writing is crazy incredible. Even her tweets and her blog posts are so clever and concise. I think that the Shiver series was the first, or sorry, it's the Wolves of Mercy Falls series. I believe these were the first books that she published. They certainly were before the Raven Boys. So it was cool to see, like, there were moments where I was like, oh, that's Maggie Stiefvater. Like, there's her writing style poking through there. It was cool to see that, but I was just kind of bored. I only read the first one. I'm not going to be continuing with them. I think maybe if I'd read them when I was 12, I would have really liked them. But yeah, it was fine. I'm glad I read it. The next one was Akata Witch, and this broke my heart to not like. This is another young adult fantasy. It takes place in Nigeria, and it incorporates a lot of Nigerian culture. I loved that aspect of it. The setting was really cool. It's about another young girl who discovers that she has what they call juju. It's magic powers. I made a dedicated review video about this because I was so frustrated about it. So if you want my full thoughts, you can find them there. But yeah, this... I wanted to love this book so bad, and I just really, really didn't. That was probably my biggest letdown of the year. The next book was another recommendation and lent book from a friend, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. Lori Gottlieb is a therapist, and this book is her memoir. She talks about her experiences with her therapist, and then she also talks about a few of her clients, and their names and details are changed so you wouldn't be able to figure out who they are. Obviously their privacy is protected, but it wasn't a perfect book. There were moments where I didn't quite agree with some of her assessments, and things sometimes got a little bit long-winded. However, this book just punched me in the face. This book is really an exploration of how we can be kind to ourselves, how we can discover empathy with people that we perhaps wouldn't otherwise empathize with. It's a book about healing from all sorts of different kinds of traumas. I will just say that I felt very seen and very called out. Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. Myra, I don't know. Oh, okay. This book is a horror sci-fi. The basics, I suppose, are that years ago, this mockumentary film company sent out a boat to find mermaids in the Mariana Trench. They did not actually think they were going to find mermaids. They were just making their stupid movie. But they did find mermaids, and they were horrific, and the boat was discovered just like empty, no people on it. And the footage that they recover is very haunting, very creepy, and a lot of people think that it's a hoax. The book takes place 7 years after this event, and we have another crew of people who are going to go back to the Mariana Trench and discover what happened. And wow, wow, wow. The mermaids, chilled me to my core. The character work was so good. The representation was incredible. So many wonderful women, so many wonderful people of color, and like from different places, not just like one black person. One of the main characters was a bisexual woman who calls herself bisexual out loud, and I had like a spiritual experience when I read that. I was listening to the audiobook, and I went back and I listened to it a couple times because I was so excited. And I really related to her and her experiences with her sexuality. If you don't follow me on other social media, I'm also a bisexual. So I was very excited about that. And I just, it was so good. It was good. I read it around Halloween time for like the spook factor, and it did not disappoint. Another Neil Gaiman. I actually read quite a bit of Neil Gaiman this year. Norse mythology. This is Neil Gaiman's it's not a retelling. It's sort of his continuation of the tradition of telling these stories of the Norse gods over and over again. And they were fun. They were cool. I learned a lot. They're little myth stories, so they kind of all fit together. Like they're all like a story of one set of characters, but because they're myths, they're all sort of separate little stories, and so it's very easy to pick up and put down. Haha, one I actually have a physical copy of. This is Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. This is Virginia Woolf's essay about women writers. Her premise is essentially that people need space and stability in order to create art. They need a room of their own, and she says 500 pounds a year, 500, yeah. Something like that. And while there have always been poor men who did not have space or stability, there also have always been a ruling class of men who get to control all of the space and the money. And that is why throughout history, the vast majority of successful writers and artists of all kinds have been men. Women have always had a much harder time with creating because they didn't get to control the money or the space or have their own space or have uninterrupted time to themselves. Even wealthy women throughout history have not had that luxury, have always had to answer to their husbands and have had to set aside their creative endeavors and their genius for the sake of the people around them. And if you are a woman writer, if you are a male writer, actually, one of my favorite lines from this book is in the foreword where she says, "I shall be attacked for a feminist and hinted at for a sapphist," to which I say, goals. This next book I got as an advanced reader copy from the bookstore where I was working, and I did not do the thing you're supposed to do with arcs, which is read them before the book comes out. This book has been out for a minute, but this is The Black Kids by Christina Hammonds Reed. It's probably been compared to The Hate U Give enough, so I mean, I just did it, but it's a young adult book that takes place in the 90s. It's about a young black girl who goes to a white private school and has a very privileged life after 4 LAPD officers are acquitted after beating a black man, Rodney King, to death. Things change for her, and she starts to become more aware of systemic injustice and everything that comes along with that. But it's also just kind of a story about her as a teenager. It's a lot of things, and it's really good. It was sometimes very hard to read, as stories like this often are, but for that reason, I think that it is important to read, or at least important to read books like it. And this one, it was written in such a way that I literally felt like Ash, the main character, was like sitting in front of me. I could just hear her voice so clearly. The writing is just, it's so good. And finally, my last book of the year was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This book is about a man who goes back to his childhood home for a funeral, and while he's there, he goes back to this farmhouse that was down the street from where he lived as a kid, and all of these strange memories start coming back to him about this fantastical time that he spent with these people. It's spooky. It's hard to explain, as Gaiman books I am finding tend to be. It was an experience. I liked it. I have questions. It's one of those kind of just like bizarre fantasy stories. It was good. It was good. I'm sorry, that's an underwhelming way to end my list, but that's how I feel. This was a really cool and good year of reading for me. I read a lot of new favorites, specifically The Raven Boys, Dracula, Into the Drowning Deep, and The Lord of the Rings. My goodness. I read my first manga this year. That was cool. I read more nonfiction this year than I have ever read in my life by choice. I only read like 2. And, you know, for all that 2020 has been a raging dumpster fire, this part of it, for me at least, was really good and a lot of fun, and that's it. That's all that I have to say. My cat is snorting particularly loud. Let's have a chat. Have you read any of the books that I read this year? What did you read this year? I want to know. Tell me. Tell me. Tell me. All right, bye. Like and subscribe, I guess.